From Asia News Weekly, this is Asia Now. Today on Asia Now, is Korea's culture to blame for its transportation and construction disasters? Hello everyone, I'm Steve Miller. It seems every time there's a huge disaster affecting South Korea, the question of whether or not its culture played a role seems to surface. It happened with Asiana Flight 214, and again with the recent Sewol sinking tragedy. With the latter, the theory was that Koreans' Confucian history made the students more obedient, thus they obeyed the crew orders to remain still, rather than flee for their lives. That notion is absurd. As in any emergency situation, one will always defer judgment to the experts. And in this case, the students thought the crew themselves were those experts. I mean, think about it. You're young, you're scared, and you don't know what to do. When a voice comes on the PA system telling you to stay put, you will. But this tragic accident was just the first of many such incidents this past month. In addition to the Sewol tragedy, where over 300 perished, a subway train collided on Seoul's busy line number 2, leading to the metro's chief to resign. And just recently, an office-tel, a kind of joint commercial and residential building, sunk into the ground and shifted more than 20 degrees overnight. Finally, a report was released noting that nearly 1/3 of all of Seoul's subway tracks aren't earthquake-safe. These are just recent events, but not some of the biggest in Korea's modern past. Going back 20 years, here are some additional catastrophes. The Sewol ferry disaster in 1993, which claimed 292 lives. The 1994 Sungsu bridge collapse, where 32 people lost their lives, and the Sangpun department store collapse, which killed 502 people in 1995, and not to mention the Daegu gas explosion in 1995 that claimed 101 lives, and finally the 1999 Sealand fire, which resulted in the deaths of 23 people, including 19 kindergartners. In each case, the accidents themselves could have been foreseen and prevented if proper regulations were in place, and more importantly, followed. With a country that's usually considered on the cutting edge of technology, one has to wonder why these events still occur. Is culture to blame? Now, before we go any further, it's important to understand and define culture. According to Merriam-Webster, culture is defined as the following: the beliefs, customs, arts, etc. of a particular society, group, place, or time. However, the tertiary definition should also be noted. It reads, a way of thinking, behaving, or working that exists in a place or organization. Kim Hoo-ran writes, the culture of bali-bali, or hurry-hurry, is a byproduct of the era which saw economic development as an overreaching goal. The whole country was in overdrive, disregarding rules and procedures if necessary, as it pursued accelerated economic development. Following decades of such circumvention of laws, Korean society became desensitized to the risks it was taking. Based on Kim's statement and the dictionary, well, we are in fact dealing with a cultural phenomenon. However, I hesitate to label it as such and prefer to think of it as an attitude. Park Gil-sung from Korea University says, together, baseless optimism and adventurism heightens the explosiveness of potential risks. Add self-exceptionalism to the combination, and this leads to an insensitivity to risks. And that insensitivity to risk is precisely what's the problem. I often see construction workers drinking beer during work hours, and once I even witnessed a construction worker go into a 7-Eleven, purchase 2 bottles of soju, a vodka-like distilled liquor that has about 20% alcohol by volume, and a liter of water. Once the transaction was completed, he poured out the water and substituted its contents for soju. Now, one has to wonder if actions like this contribute to Korea's more than 6-fold greater number of workplace fatalities over that of Australia, a country with half the population. At a nearby intersection, passenger vehicles, commercial trucks, and more alarmingly, public buses routinely plow through the intersection, regardless of whether or not a pedestrian is preparing to cross during a red light. In fact, just today, I was walking through that same intersection. Traffic had a red light, the pedestrian signal was green, and I was almost leveled by a dump truck that failed to stop. Buses also circumvent traffic queues and make left turns from the center lane regardless if they have the right of way or not. Sometimes they even jump ahead of other motorists patiently waiting in line for that left turn arrow. These are not isolated cases, but reflect occurrences in everyday life. Does it happen all the time? Well, of course not. But they do happen with such regularity that one is not surprised when they do occur. Immediately following the Sewol sinking, one grieving family member raised the question of whether or not Korea was truly a developed nation, because in his mind, a developed nation would not have responded in which the way Korea had. The fallout from the Sewol ferry sinking has been so great that has led to a pair of presidential apologies, resignation from the prime minister, an incredibly comprehensive search to prosecute those responsible, and vows of reform. But in 20 years, little has changed. Even today, despite citations of Jung, or the close-knit feeling of connectiveness usually used to describe how Koreans relate to one another, which actually happens to be perfectly exemplified in how the nation has come together this past month, many Koreans still exhibit a me-first attitude in this Bali society. This can be seen with the refusal to give way to ambulances in traffic, or the common practice of parking on the sidewalk or on busy streets where parking is clearly prohibited. In one area outside of Seoul, the street is so crowded with parked cars, the street has essentially become a one-way street, and city parking enforcement officials simply drive by with little effect. I even recall walking in Myeongdong once, and along a major road near Namsan Tunnel 3, 3 large motor coaches were all parked and stopped in the street, reducing traffic to a single lane. Implementing new safety protocols will only be effective if they are followed, and more importantly, enforced. It's on that second point that Korea's track record doesn't look too good. But what do you think? Will these latest series of accidents be enough to instill a need to follow through on the reforms being promised and make permanent changes? Or will they simply be forgotten in the coming months? Be sure to let me know in the comment section on Facebook or Twitter. Just go to facebook.com/Asia News Weekly or look to @Asia News Weekly on Twitter. If you're interested in more stories from the Asia Pacific region, be sure to subscribe to our other podcast, Asia News Weekly. For Asia Now, I'm Steve Miller. Asia Now is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.